For those listening, not yesterday, but what are we now? No, it would have been Tuesday morning. You would have heard me chat with Dr. Matt Shelton of NZDSOS. And that has had quite an effect. We've had over 62,000 views of that video interview. We talked through first of all, his experience and the hit he's taken on his career for speaking out about what he thinks needs to be talked about. So that's number one. We talked through safety of vaccine, potential injuries. We talked about the government messaging and media lockstep. Let me put it like that. So we kind of try to get our arms around, and I would say the other side of the story, because mainstream media hasn't been covering any of this. And anyone who brings anything up, Dr. Shelton, 37-year veteran GP in the UK and here in New Zealand, I think he said he'd seen tens of thousands of patients. So a real-world guy. And he's been shut down. He's lost his job, or he can't practice right now. They've taken his certificate away, though he can still call himself a doctor. Now, that's what's happening here. What I'm interested in doing is finding out what like countries are doing and where they're at. And I think our next guest will be able to give us some insight into that. And he is former Qantas Airline Captain Graham Hood. Welcome to our program. Hoodie.
Great to talk to you, Paul, and I really enjoyed the preamble, the promo for your show. We need more platforms around the world.
Well, thank you for that. Now, I became aware of you, and it just kind of came out of the blue. I think it was a Facebook post. And here was this man, and you look like an airline captain. I'll tell you that. I've known quite a few. You look like one. You're classic. Well, they call it central casting. And there you were in your uniform at home. Yep. And you removed your epaulets, 4 stripes.
Yep.
And threw it in. And ended your career. Now, you didn't have to, but you did that. And that blew a lot of people away, Graham. Tell us about that act.
It was actually, I did have to do it because sometimes your conscience is so overwhelming, you just have to go with it. I consider myself fairly much asleep until about 2019. I started to wake up to a lot of things that were going on. I've never dabbled in anything too underground media-wise. I've tried to form my opinions in the mainstream, which I see now as being foolish. But I had given consent for my stepmother to be vaccinated in a nursing home earlier that year. That was 2021. And I became aware that Qantas were going to mandate the jab for international crew. I kind of understood that because a lot of countries were not letting anyone in unless they were. And I knew that was detrimental to the business. But then when they started talking about mandating all frontline staff in Australia and domestic crew, of which I was one, I found that a bridge too far. I queried it. I advised the company that I would probably go with Pfizer. But then I decided to do a little bit of risk-benefit analysis, which is what they pay me to do in everyday life at work. I was about to commit to was deeply flawed. There was a narrative attached to it because I started asking mainstream doctors what's going on with this vaccine. Is it going to be safe? Has it had high altitude testing for pilots? Will I pass my medical every 6 months? All these questions. And the answers came back, we don't know. And when I asked doctors, do they think I should take it? 3 of the doctors I asked said, look, I wouldn't rush into it if I were you, but don't tell anyone I told you. And when I inquired about that, they said they could be deregistered, and that's when I knew there was a rat in the cheese factory. Huh. And when I saw so many careers about to go down the drain because of people wanting to choose what went into their body, I started posing questions around the airline, like, have we changed our safety policy? Would you be happy for me to fly a Boeing 737 from Brisbane to Melbourne with an experimental fuel on board that had never been tested and the aircraft full of passengers? Of course, the answer was no. So then why are you asking us or demanding that we put an experimental procedure into our body without knowing the full side effects and the ramifications of that. It didn't make sense. And when Alan Joyce came out and said that anyone who decides against a vaccine is deciding against a career in aviation, that was all I needed. I was incensed by that comment, because he's talking about people in this career who, like me, have wanted to do it since they were 5 years old. You know, that doesn't affect. He can go on and run some other organisation somewhere, and the sooner the better, as far as I'm concerned. But to push that was just a bridge way too far. So as one of the most senior guys, I decided to make the video because I probably had the least to lose. Yeah.
After seeing that video, I did a little more my own research, Graham. I did a bit more research and kind of, because I was curious about you. I have a big interest in aviation. I've never been an airline pilot, but I'm always interested to follow that sector, let's say. So I went and looked and saw more of what you'd done in the past, and I realised that not only were you a senior pilot, but you were some kind of mentor. You were a go-to in the company for your colleagues, perhaps younger colleagues. Obviously, you've got great experience. You're one of the old-timers, let's say. So you must have been in a unique position to see how this decision was affecting people. What did you see?
Oh, Paul, that is such a good question, because it deserves a good answer. I started to get phone calls from people who were worried. I've always run a very good workplace when I've gone to work. I've always kept it light. I've always tried to create a good working environment where people can just flourish and do their job as well-trained professionals. And I have had a welfare role, albeit unofficial, in the company for many years. And when this started to happen, there were groups forming to organise how we try and turn this around. And I got on a Zoom call one day, and I think there were about 300 people. These were cabin crew as well, and not only Qantas employees, but employees of other airlines. And it was a very moving experience, because on the Zoom call, there were only about 4 or 5 of us who showed their faces. All the rest were, just their names on a black screen. And as I listened to their stories, it became obvious that these people were in distress. Their career warning lights were flashing in front of their eyes. And I made a comment. I said, look, I've got a feeling we're about to go to war. And if I'm going to be in the trenches with all of you, I want to see what you look like. So please turn your video on. And with that, all these faces lit up on the screen. Many of them were looking rather dishevelled, some looking obviously depressed. There were some in tears. It was obviously very hard for a lot of these people. Forget about the mortgages and all that they'd signed up to and committed to. They were seeing their childhood dreams going down the toilet, and it was so distressing. And I realised that I was probably the oldest one in the group, and I flouted the idea that somebody needed to go public to bring this out into the attention of mainstream, hopefully. And we know how stupid that thought was. But I decided I was the oldest kid on the block. I had another 2 years I needed to work to complete a project that we're setting up here and a welfare thing that we're doing. And I realised that this was going to be more important. So I made the video. I didn't rehearse it. I didn't script it. It just came out, and I sent it, and that was it.
Yeah, sort of jumping back to the first question, that video again. How did, when you finished that piece to camera, how did it feel? I took it to my wife first up. She was gardening, and I sat out in the garden with her, and I said, "Watch this." And she watched it, and she looked at me, and she said, "Oh dear." She said, "You're going to send it, aren't you?" I said, "Well, yes, and if I do, it'll be the end of my career and possibly the end of the dream that we've started here." And she said, "Yeah, I realise that, but I also realise how important your integrity and your honour are to you." And she said, "We always said at the beginning that we would live in a tent happily as long as we were together, so do what you must." And I sent it to a friend who was going to get it out on social media, because I'm not very good at that stuff.
And by, I think, early the next day, it had 7 million views on different platforms around the world. And that was a very telling thing. I knew my career would end. I knew the company weren't going to take it lightly. But the real cruncher for me was a week later when I resigned. And I wrote a heartfelt 2-page resignation, which I had to do so I could keep speaking. Otherwise, I would have been under their control. And I read it to my wife, and we both had a cry. And then I hovered over the send button on my laptop.
Yeah.
And she said, "Are you going to send it?" And I pressed it, and I heard that sound that when your email goes off.
Yeah.
And when I heard that sound, I said, "There goes my career. It's all gone." And I just burst into tears. It's still emotional when I think about it. It was a tough thing, but in retrospect now, I'm a better person for it. I'm so glad that I did it.
I want to get back to the flying thing later on in this chat. I don't know how long we'll go, but we've got a bit of time. And I want to get your view on safety-related matters, if you're up for it. I don't want to drill you down too hard on those things, but I think that's something that needs to come into people's thinking if they're using airline services.
I'm happy to.
Yeah. You've been to a lot of events. You've come into contact with so many people. You've travelled around Australia, small communities, big cities. You've been posting a lot of material as you go. What have you found?
Yeah. I found the spirit of Australia, which I thought had gone. A good friend of mine over here, Michael Gray Griffith, has done a series called The Deplorables. He's travelled around and filmed people's stories. And I talked to him about his journey, and I said, "What's it been like?" He said, "I've been on a tour through a broken heart." And that's what it's felt like for us. We've followed sort of roughly along behind him, not filming too much, but we're mainly talking to people and trying to bind them together in a sense of community. And we have noticed that the resilience, the adaptability, and the willingness to stand in truth of so many people. Paul, I'm talking about hundreds of thousands of people who are saying that, this has got nothing to do with health. We're standing up because government overreach has gone way too far. And I thought the spirit of Australia had gone because, as Michael said too in another podcast that he did after our so-called election, he said Australians had two choices last Saturday. It was either freedom or latte, and most of them chose latte. And I thought that made me cry. I just thought, have we come to that? I mean, I'm really big on our war history. I'm really big on our associations with the Kiwis. The Anzac thing is something I push at every meeting. And I've watched New Zealand go down the same path. And I asked myself, how can we live in that history and allow this to happen? How can we let those white crosses on foreign battlefields of our shared armies be sacrificed for nothing? And I really despaired for that, but I've seen that coming back, and I'm sure that's alive and well in New Zealand as well. So I'm really, really pleased to say that we are going to bounce back from this. We're going to do things very differently, but we have to do it differently. The things we've done in the past have allowed what's happened now to happen on our watch.
Yeah, you're basically, I think, describing the kind of experience here, obviously smaller scale. Pushing on with this against counter-information, the speed at which all this happened with lack of testing, a completely new technology apparently vaccine isn't the word. Let's be honest about that. It's not a vaccine as we used to know it. And the media, and I know that you've had many engagements with media, and you weren't too happy about mainstream media, what I picked up earlier on when we were chatting earlier. So, you hear that word lockstep, Graham, and there do seem. Do you think that there's sort of kind of weird synchronicity going on here that you normally wouldn't see? That there are a certain bunch of countries, let's say Australia and New Zealand, that are doing kind of following the same playbook, as if everyone's talking to each other and deciding, yeah, we'll do this here, we'll do that there. And do you get that feeling?
Oh, it's more than a feeling. I mean, the evidence is there. You can watch many video clips of your Prime Minister, our Prime Minister, the Canadian Prime Minister, the Dutch Prime Minister, all in lockstep with the puppet master who is Klaus Schwab. I mean, you don't have to go down rabbit warrens to see that. That's there for everybody to see on the World Economic Forum website. We know this is all about bringing this planet to a massive great reset, which is going to affect all of us in ways we'd never imagined. So that's why I'm always happy to say this is not about whether somebody chooses to be vaccinated or not. This is about global control. And it's there for anyone to see. It's there in plain sight. They're not even bothering to hide it. So what disturbs me the most about mainstream media is that they are owned by the same companies. You trace the ownership back of all the big corporations in the world, and they all go back to BlackRock and Vanguard. Let's be honest about that. That's there in plain sight for everyone to see. And when we understand that there is this massive agenda going on, we can see why mainstream are complicit. Because if they had been doing their job as the fourth estate and telling it like it is, this would have been over 2 years ago. But they're not. We're seeing massive blockades of tractors in Holland. The Canadian truckies revolt. All these massive things. Even in Australia, 1.2 million people gathered on the lawns of Parliament House on the 12th of February, and the mainstream reported it as 10,000. Nothing is being reported of what's going on in Europe, and hardly anything about what's going on in Sri Lanka at the moment. And that is a clear indicator that they are trying to keep those who are not yet seeing the big picture in the dark, so that they don't add to the revolt. Because I think most fair-thinking people on the planet would have to say, we need to get involved in this, and that's the last thing they want. So they are definitely in lockstep, actually in goose step.
Yeah. You mentioned lattes before. Does it surprise you at such that people have such a low threshold for measuring their freedom?
It does, but I understand how it's happened. I think this has been beautifully managed by, let's call them the opposition to freedom. It's been beautifully managed. We have been set up for decades. We have become addicted to mainstream media. Reality television, which has taken over all forms of media, seems to be our playbook for life. You know, we have advertising campaigns that tell us that you're not a man unless you wear Calvin Klein or Nike shoes. There's all this programming that's been going on for so long, and we've become soft on this. And I can see how it's all played out. In actual fact, we have decided that, fed on the narrative of fear that we have, and I go back to the Cuban Missile Crisis in the 60s when I was a young fella, we've been fed on a diet of fear ever since then. It's one thing after another. It's the hole in the ozone layer. It's peak oil. It's the Y2K bug. It's 9/11. It's all these different variants of different flus and viruses going around, and it's global financial crises, all this sort of stuff. There's a constant feed through the media of fear, false evidence appearing real, and we've fallen for it. And as a result of falling for that, we've trusted institutions and governments and corporations to do our thinking for us. And in doing that, we've given control to them. So now we're starting to realise that all those trusted institutions all around the world, and there's absolutely not one institution on the planet that I trust anymore. They've all let us down. And so I think Australians have actually decided that freedom requires too much responsibility. They're happy to give that responsibility to government, and they're going to rue the day that they did it.
And then there's the medical establishment, industry, sector, from doctors on up.
Yeah.
What do you make of the state of medicine now and people's relationship to it?
Well, I think the circle of trust in medicine has been shattered. There are a lot of people here in Australia who have gone along. Even a breakfast television announcer yesterday was interviewing Dr. Nick Coatsworth, one of our senior immunologists. And he said, look, I'm just tired of being told what to do by the government. We've complied. We've done everything you wanted. You're still asking for more. Let us make our own choices, get out of our lives. And we're starting to see that narrative start to come forward. But I think I think we're seeing the tie-up between Big Pharma and the medical profession. We've seen all the junkets. We know that there's big money in it. We know that there are doctors and health providers that are in lockstep with Big Pharma because it's a lucrative business. And I think we haven't had a proper health system in any Western country in the world. We've had a disease management system. And if we were serious about health, we would ban fast food. We would ban sugary drinks. We would ban alcohol and tobacco. But we won't do that because there's big money in that for government. And the people would, would rise up if you shut down fast food outlets or hotels. People would rise up in revolt. But when it comes to health, we need to get back to basics. We need to go back to basic healthy living, better diets, lots of exercise, get out, in fact, do all those things that they've been locking us down from doing in the last 2 years, and let our immune systems do what they do. And now we're building immune systems that are reliant on government, just like the people are. And that's going to fail us. We're just setting ourselves up. The medical profession is in dire straits. And I might add, so are the law enforcement agencies around the world who have been in lockstep with governments and doing unspeakable things to the citizens of their countries.
Yeah, we've had a bit of that here with our smaller protests. You mentioned, over 1 million. We didn't get to that, but we had that sort of confrontation, and it was brutal. You sounded optimistic before. You said, I can't remember the exact words, but it was along the lines of we'll get through this and presumably to a better place on the other side. What is your vision then of, you've met, and there's plenty more to talk about, but the kind of changes that you've just been talking about, we've been discussing. What is your vision for that? Bearing in mind people will still want to have technology and they'll want to enjoy, what they've used to having as a standard of living. What is your concept of that? And do you think it's workable?
Look, I think it is workable. I think what I've come to realise in the last 3 months, Michelle and I have done 20,000 kilometres in this tour that we've done in 3 months, and we've spoken at, we haven't even counted how many venues yet to how many people. But I think I get a vision that if we can pull this together, no matter what comes, we will look back on this COVID experience, many of us, and realise that it was something we needed to go through in order to bring us to a better place. Now, when people say, I want to go back to the 2019 normal, I say, you can keep that. I'm not interested in that. That was the normal of 2018, 2019 created what we're living in now because we've been indoctrinated. I believe we have to go back further, but that doesn't exclude having technology in our lives. Sorry about that. I've got a dry throat. But we need to go back to a sense of community where technology doesn't govern what we do, but people do. So instead of leaning over the back fence and asking your neighbour how he's going, we talk with our thumbs. We're losing that interaction between people. And the one thing I do at every gathering, hundreds of people that I speak to, is I get them all to hug each other. That's the first thing I do because they've been starved from human contact for 2 years. And they all look reticent to do it at the beginning. And then it takes 5 minutes for them to stop. And you've actually got to call them back to order so you can complete your conversation with them because they're loving it. And they're meeting people that they've never met for the first time. And they're communicating in ways that they'd never thought of. And they're building ideas and alternative strategies to get through this together. And I believe that will build an adaptability and community that will enable us to weather any storm that comes to the best of our ability. We don't know what's coming. We can look ahead and think, this is, there's some stuff coming in biblical proportions. And that brings me to the fact that I really believe, as a man of faith, that we need to bring faith back into our communities. Because the more we've taken God out of our societies, the darker things have become. And we need to build something around faith, not religion. Corporate religion has let us all down. Corporate religion does not promote a faith-based society that's healthy. And we've got to come back to a faith-based society where we actually love and trust one another as Jesus did when he walked on the planet. And when we do that, we start to win. So I think based on all those things, and the other big thing for me has been calling men out, because in the last year I've seen the absence of men. I mean, real men. There's men there, but they're not standing up. They've been shattered over decades, in fact, a couple of centuries. And this has been a ploy by this New World Order to break down the family unit, because if you do that, you break down community. And so men have lost their way. And at every event in the last few weeks, I've described how that's happened. I've told men it's not your fault that this has happened. You've been set up to fall into this trap. But if you want out of that trap and you want to stand in a place of manhood that creates a society where women and children can flourish in safety, and we can have the role of standing in the breach and being the watchman on the wall and the sheepdog on the hill, come up the front and join me. Stand with me. And hundreds of men with tears in their eyes have come up and done that. And that's really big for the Australian culture. I believe with the Māori culture of New Zealand, that would be much easier to do. But Australian men are actually standing up in their hundreds and saying, we've got to change the way we think. So I think that we will look back, and if we get this right, we will lower the rates of male suicide, we will lower the rates of single-parent families, we will lower the rates of addictions, we will disempower the child protection agencies and the family law courts, and we will actually get back to a community, family-based society that holds us together in good stead for whatever comes. I think we will look back on this time, if we get this right, and say, wow, we needed to do that.
Yeah. Okay. How many hours have you got, Graham?
36,000, I think it is, yeah.
Well, that's way up there. And I think at the time you took the epaulets off and threw well, not, you didn't throw in the towel at all, but threw it in on principle. You were, I think, a 737 captain. You probably know Australia like the back of your hand. Maybe you've even flown over to New Zealand a few times, I would imagine, because that aircraft seems to pop up here at our airports, that type. Anyway, you know...
I've flown to New Zealand.
Yep. Carry on.
I've done many a landing in windy Wellington.
What's that like?
It's good fun. At least they align the runway with the wind direction. So I've actually come into land at Wellington with 60-knot winds. Coming over the mountains is no fun, though.
Yeah. So you know your stuff. It's like the doctor that we had, Matt Shelton, in here. He'd done 37 years of GP. So he's a real-world guy. You're a real-world guy. There are people... Are there people in cockpits flying aeroplanes with problems?
Look, there are. Medical problems, you mean?
Absolutely.
Yes, there are. Anecdotally, there's the evidence, the phone calls I'm getting from people within the Australian airline industry clearly indicates there are issues. That needs to be addressed. When I contacted the Civil Aviation Safety Authority medical department in Australia, that's the peak body over here. They are strict on absolutely everything. If you take any flu medication or cold medication, if you get a head cold, you can't go to work. And I posed several questions to them. First one was, can you tell me about the long-term side effects? We don't know. The short-term side effects? We don't know. Have you done any high-altitude testing for pilots? We don't know. Will I pass my 6-monthly medical if I get this thing? We don't know. I mean, that's the level of their understanding of this. And when you pose the why don't you know question, well, the World Health Organization have given us the directives and we trust them. Well, I'm sorry, that's like me asking another pilot to do a walk-around inspection of my aircraft and taking his word for it. We don't do that. There are some things you just don't do, and that's one of them. But the more we speak out, the more evidence we're getting of people like one of my former colleagues, a co-pilot that I've flown with a lot, I believe was off work for 6 months with pulmonary embolism. I don't know that he's even gone back yet. I know of 4 very hard to explain deaths of youngish pilots in Australia that didn't happen at work, but happened on their days off. I know of several flight attendants who've had to be defibrillated in the aircraft, and that was something that was never heard of when I was flying. You never heard of a cabin crew member having to be defibrillated or having a major health event in flight. It was unheard of. And the list goes on and on and on. I'm hearing pilots saying that they've had to hand over control to their co-pilot because they felt faint. They were having dizzy spells. One guy said that he went numb down one side. Another guy said that he wasn't able to string two words together on approach to land. These things are concerning. The concerning and safety effective, having an effect on safety, they do. But people have to keep all this in perspective as well.
Right. So don't think that, yeah, like you say, keep it in perspective. But it's something that people should be aware of, though, given...
Yes, it is. I'm asked at every meeting about is it safe? Well, if you look at the law of probability, you've got the captain is normally older than the first officer. You've got two pilots on the flight deck, in some cases more, and on longer wide-bodied aircraft, longer international flights. The chances of everyone falling over at the one time are remote.
Yeah.
And the automation systems are such that they can deal with much of that. And also, in most of the airlines, like in the region we fly in, Air New Zealand, Qantas, and the other carriers in those countries, the standard of training is very high. So the co-pilot is pretty much equally as qualified as the captain to do most of the flying. The only thing is there are some aspects of aviation in bad weather, some situations where the captain has to be the pilot flying. And if the most senior age-wise pilot is flying in a high adrenaline situation, such as, severe weather approaches and landings or takeoffs, if the adrenaline's pumping and this guy's going to have an event, if that happens in the final stages of that takeoff or landing, that could be way too critical for the first officer to take over at such a time. And this is something that's factored into everything in aviation for decades. But they're glossing over that in this particular instance. It's like they don't want to know about it. But we have practiced in the simulator so many different scenarios that you would say that would never happen. I don't know why we're training this. But in this situation, it's different. But when I've seen a document from United Airlines in America that's requiring all their pilots over there to study up on subtle incapacitation of another crew member. In other words, what are you going to do if the pilot flying falls over? So they're ramping up their training on that. So all the indicators are that the people who really have safety at heart, safety over dollars, are considering that there is a risk here that needs to be evaluated. But when people say to me, is it safe for me to fly? Well, I still say the most dangerous part of my day was driving to work. Flying is inherently safe. It is safe because well-practiced norms have been practiced over and over again. We've always evaluated accidents and learned from our mistakes, but we're not doing that in the case of this vaccine or this procedure, this gene therapy. We're not doing that. The whole thing has fallen over around this mandate and around this narrative, and I think that's going to be a forerunner for detrimental things in the future. I saw a town hall meeting held by Qantas executives the other day, and they said that the number of 737 pilots on sick leave is currently double the normal pre-COVID average. It's double. Now, that's an indicator of a couple of things. They said it's because they're getting COVID or they're getting the flu. Nothing was mentioned that they may be having side effects from the vaccine. And nothing was mentioned about the usual factor that brings up sick leave in aviation, and that is morale is rock bottom. People don't want to go to work when they don't like going to work because the morale's low. And the morale in the airline industry, and in Qantas in particular at the moment, has never been worse. And that breeds a whole new human factor into safety that people need to take into account as well. This is a melting pot that, if it isn't corrected, could lead to disaster in the future. But we've got to be practical, and we've got to be honest about it, and we've got to do what we've always done, and that's debrief, evaluate, what could we have done better, what can we do to turn this trend around and start acting on it. But bean counters at the top of the airline industry, they're good at making profits, but they're not very good at running the airline so that you don't cut corners.
Graham, it's been great to chat with you. Thank you for making some time for us. It's really good to get an insight. I mean, yeah, we are kind of cousins. That ANZAC thing, it's still strong amongst a lot of people here, Graham. You know, some of us have family members that we can remember who, well, in my case, were affected quite a bit by what they went through 80 years ago. And, you know, it took a lot of guts and principle to put your body on the line, basically, for that. And it's sort of kind of hard to reconcile that effort and the reasons for doing that for what we are sort of seeing now. So good to chat with you. All the best, and we'll keep an eye out for your activities now that I'm more aware of what you've been doing. Are you missing the flying? Last question. Are you missing the flying?
I went for a fly in the light aircraft the other day. I went up with my friend John Larder. He's got a little old aeroplane that he bought very cheaply, and we went up for a fly, and he said, "Here, have a go." And he said, "Boy, you haven't lost it." I really enjoyed it. But look, I guess I'm flying in a different way now. But, you know, getting back to that Anzac thing, Paul, we visited Albany on the southwest coast of WA, which was the last part of the Australian mainland that the Anzacs saw when they sailed off to the Dardanelles. And there were Kiwis on board. That flotilla had quite a large contingent of Kiwis on board. And I imagined, as I stood on the cliffs looking at the landfall, that those men would have stared at when they sailed over the horizon. They would have been Kiwis and Aussies standing on the fantails of those steamers, looking back and probably talking to each other, having a smoke, and even maybe with their arm around each other saying, "We're off, boys, let's see where this leads." And that spirit's alive and well, and we're looking forward in the not-too-distant future, if we're allowed, to coming over to New Zealand and doing a tour there like we've done here in Australia.
And that might have been the last view of home for many of them too, yeah.
It was, and we can't afford to let that go for nothing. You know, there was the movie Saving Private Ryan. The last scene of that movie was Captain Miller, who was leading the rescue attempt for Private Ryan, was dying on a bridge. He'd just been shot. And the private that he was trying to save and get home to his mother, and all those men died for, he looked down at the dying Captain Miller, and Captain Miller looked up at him and said, "James, earn this." And James said, "What, sir?" He said, "Earn this." In other words, men have sacrificed so much, and women have sacrificed so much for you to have this. Earn it. And we're not earning that sacrifice. None of us are. We've let it go. And even those of us who are standing, are we standing hard enough? Are we standing strong enough? Are we speaking loud enough? It's something we all need to ponder in the coming days.
All the best, Graham Hood. Hoodie, thank you for coming on the platform today, and we'll get this posted out. It'll go far and wide, I'm sure. All the best to you, and maybe we'll chat again some other time, all right?
Really like to do that. Thank you so much, Paul.
Okay, Graham Hood, Captain Graham Hood, former Qantas 737 captain. When you say 35,000 hours, that's impressive. And, well, you heard the story. Don't need to sort of repeat any of that.